The year was 1937. The setting? Beijing, then known as Peking. 19-year-old Pamela Werner was the adopted daughter of an established British diplomat and had spent the vast majority of her life in the Chinese capital. She was fluent in Mandarin, knew her way around the city well, and had many friends who she socialized with frequently. On a cold evening in January, Pamela went ice skating with her friends. She was due to leave for London in a few days to further her education, and wanted to spend some quality time with the people she cared about the most. At around 7 PM, Pamela said goodbye to her friends. This would be the last time they'd ever see her alive. The next morning, Pamela's mutilated corpse was discovered by the last surviving section of Peking's Ming Dynasty wall, only a short walk from her home. Her ribs were broken, and many of her organs had been cut out. Her heart, kidneys, liver, and bladder were missing. Her throat had been slashed open so deeply that her head was almost severed. Her right arm was barely still connected to her torso. The frozen ground around her was stained red. The expensive watch on her wrist had stopped a few minutes after midnight. It remains unclear what happened to Pamela after she left the ice rink that night. There's no concrete evidence to tell us where she went, what she may or may not have got up to, or who she may or may not have bumped into. With all that said, two prominent theories do exist. Paul French and Graham Shepherd have both published books about the murder mystery of Miss Werner, but the authors paint two very different pictures. In fact, the only thing they both seem to agree on is that Pamela's life came to an end with a blow to the head. I'll start with French's version of events, which he presents in his book, Midnight in Peking. After researching the case extensively, French believes it's most likely that after skating with her friends, Pamela met up with another group of females to go to a party. The party was being hosted by an American dentist in the city, Wentworth Prentice. Prentice and his friends were known for not being the nicest of people, put it like that. Not the kind of guys you'd bring back home to mother. Pamela was a patient of the bad boy dentist, and so likely didn't feel intimidated by him or his mates. Their party eventually moved on to another place, a seedy club in a place known as the Badlands. You can imagine what kind of things went on in that neighborhood. French claims that it's here Pamela was separated from her friends. There she stood, in a room with only a bed in it, surrounded by a group of men. From there, a number of things could have happened. Maybe she resisted. Maybe she screamed. Maybe one of the men panicked and hit her over the head with something hard to shut her up. Either way, that was both the end of the party and the end of Pamela. The men then drained her body of all her blood to make her lighter and easier to move. They took her to where she was discovered the next morning, a place with no streetlights and few passers-by. Their plan was to chop up her body, make her unrecognizable, dispose of the pieces in predominantly Chinese areas, and pass the blame on to a non-existent local psychopath. The dentist and his friends were all hunting buddies, and all knew their way around a blade. They were likely interrupted when someone came by, and left Pamela where she was found. Graham Shepherd's hypothesis about what happened that night is much different. The writer himself was a former police detective, and he claims that French's version of events doesn't make sense from a policing perspective. No, his version is much more simple, and goes like this. Pamela was not the kind of girl who'd go along with a group of men to the infamous Badlands. That would have been completely out of character for her. Even if the party actually happened, it's likely that she never went to it. It's more likely that she met up with one of her old Chinese schoolmates, a man called Han Su Ching. This man would be the one to end her life after she broke his heart sometime before. He probably dumped her body in the street late that night, and then some random passers-by harvested her organs to sell for some superstitious Chinese medicine practices. A dark theory indeed. Both writers have problems with each other's version of events, but in all likelihood, we'll never know which one, if either, is correct. In 1943, the Japanese army took control of Peking, and the investigation into Pamela's demise came to an end. After the war, all interest in the case faded. Whatever evidence had been collected was already lost. We know as much now as 82 years ago. Although the circumstances of Pamela's untimely demise remain a mystery, and probably will forevermore, at least these 2 books have shone a light on her case, and ensure that she won't be forgotten to history. I'm a private investigator in a small town in central Ukraine. For the sake of my business, I can't reveal which town exactly. Heck, I probably shouldn't even be sharing this story to begin with, yet here we are. Most of the cases I've worked over the years have been unremarkable to say the least. I specialise in infidelity, and spend most of my working days spying on cheating husbands and wives, then reporting back to my client, letting them know whether their partner is innocent or guilty of double dipping, so to speak. A few years back though, I worked an unusual case, one that ended up being much darker than I anticipated. It all started when a husband and wife entered my office. They hadn't even booked an appointment. They didn't need to. Just from glancing up at them, I instantly knew who they were. The Roschas, by far the richest people in our area. They had the biggest house, nicest car. Everybody knew they were hot stuff. I asked them to take a seat and tell me how I could help them. "Sir," they explained to me, "it's our daughter, Sophia. She's run away with her new boyfriend, and we have no idea where she is. They've only known each other for a couple of weeks. They left 2 days ago. Look, she left us a note." The father handed me a crumpled up piece of paper. It read as follows. "Dear Mother and Father, I've decided to elope with my boyfriend, Andre. He's won my heart, and I wish to start a new life with him across the border. I don't know when I'll be back, if ever. Don't cry for me, for he makes me happier than anyone deserves to be. Forever yours, Sophia Roschka." They told me this was completely out of character. Not to mention, the handwriting didn't look like hers at all, and the words didn't sound like something she had put. It was all too formal. They tried calling Sophia, but she never answered. The family immediately went to the police, begging them to help find their daughter. The authorities were strangely unhelpful. They said there was no reason to be suspicious, and that the girl had just left on her own terms. The family even offered to pay the cops, seeing how rich they were and all, but even still, they refused to look into the case. That's why they came to me. I was the only person who'd be willing to help them look for her. I asked if there was anything they could give me to help me get started. They gave me several pictures of Sophia and her new boyfriend, Andre, a very handsome young man in his late 20s. Apparently, they had to snap the pictures secretly. Andre really hated being on camera. "Sir, that's not all," they told me. "You see, the reason we came to you specifically. This morning, we received an anonymous letter in the mail. We have no idea who it came from. Here." I opened the precisely folded letter and read it. "To the Roschka family, your daughter Sophia is in grave danger. Andre is not who he claims to be. The police won't help you. It may already be too late. Go to this man for help. It's your best chance. Signed, a friend." The man he named in the letter was me. The plot thickened. I agreed to help the family, told them I'd make the case my priority. They told me to do whatever I had to do. Money wasn't a factor. Problem was, with 0 leads, it was hard to know where to start looking. Turns out, a lead came to me. An hour after Sophia's parents left my office, I received a call from a private number. An unknown male voice spoke. "Listen closely. Andre will be at this location at 8 p.m. He won't be alone. It could be dangerous. If you go, be careful." I jotted down the location the stranger told me. A restaurant in the nearest city, maybe a 45-minute drive away. I then asked him the obvious question. "Who am I talking to?" "A friend. Whatever you do, don't tell the parents." "How do I know I can trust you?" "I've already said too much. Good luck." The line went cold. No doubt it was the same guy who sent the letter to the Rostchas. I thought about calling them, but decided to heed the stranger's warning. Instead, I grabbed my camera and hopped in my car outside, drove to the restaurant the guy mentioned. I made it there around 8:15. I entered and made my way to the bar, ordered a soft drink. I subtly scanned the room. There, on the corner table, was Andre, the supposed boyfriend. So much for running and eloping to another country. He was sat with a girl. It wasn't Sophia. What the hell was this guy up to? I kept an eye on them, biding my time. They paid their bill. I paid mine. They left together. I followed behind at a distance. They both got into a car outside. I got into mine. They had no idea I was tailing them as they drove off. After about 20 minutes of driving, I was startled when I saw them turn off into what looked like an abandoned factory complex. Not exactly a romantic spot. I pretended to continue on down the road, straight, then quietly pulled off to the side and switched off my headlights. I decided to get out of my car and walk into the factory grounds, not wanting Andre to know I was there too. I sneaked through the gate and into the complex. I watched as Andre switched off his engine outside the old factory. To my surprise, 2 other men emerged from the abandoned building. They were large and skin-headed, with a look of cruelty about them. That's when I heard muffled female screaming coming from inside Andre's vehicle, which only got louder as the 2 men opened the passenger side door and dragged Andre's date out. She was kicking and struggling as they dragged her into a black van waiting nearby. God damn it, human traffickers. I couldn't sit there and do nothing, but what could I do? I was unarmed. The only thing I had to hand was my camera. I lifted up the device and covertly snapped several images of the men and their license plates. The engine of the black van roared and began to make its way towards the gate I was next to. Christ, if the headlights shine on me, I'm toast. I turned and sprinted towards my car down the road on the left, the sound of the van getting louder as it approached me. I made it inside my car. The van pulled out of the complex. Please turn right. Please turn right. Damn it, it turned left. As it came to pass me, the driver turned his head, and there was no doubt he saw me huddled down in my seat. He continued on a little further down the road before I saw the van's brake lights flare. Next thing I knew, Andre's car pulled up right beside me. This was it. This was the end. Andre looked me straight in the eyes, gave me the most sinister smile I've ever seen in my life, and raised up his hand with his fingers in the shape of a gun. He pretended to shoot me, then gave me a wink and drove off behind the black van. I drove off in the opposite direction. I, of course, passed on all the information and evidence I'd collected to the police. They paid it absolutely no attention, and I immediately knew why. They were almost certainly in the pocket of whatever syndicate was behind the trafficking. You see, from what I know about this sort of thing, Andre was likely a recruiter for their organization, hired because of his good looks, charisma, and total lack of conscience. His job was probably to travel around to different towns and cities. His boss would give him money to wine and dine the girls, buy them expensive gifts, etc. He was the stereotype of what women look for in a man, at least on the surface, so it was easy for him to win their hearts. Then, once his prey was head over heels for him, he'd lure them to their doom, just like a human Venus flytrap. He'd lead them to wherever their organization had set up their temporary base of operations. As soon as they got into the car with him, it was already too late for them. They'd be forced into trucks, carted off to some secret location, and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. Their friends and family would likely never see them again. Andre was just one small cog in the machine. Unfortunately, the capturing and selling of other humans is the most profitable crime there is, so even if the police were after Andre, it wouldn't change much. The world keeps on spinning, and for as long as it does, there's gonna be evil living on it. I never did find out who the so-called friend was who sent the letter to the Rostchas and called me with the tip-off. My guess would be one of the local cops who knew something was going on. He knew he couldn't intervene, but felt the need to help out with the case anyway. He was right though. It was already too late for Sophia. Sadly, the corruption just ran too deep. In the end, I never asked Sophia's parents for any money. Ultimately, I decided to tell them that Sophia really did run off with Andre. I wanted to save them from heartbreak, from knowing that their daughter suffered the worst fate imaginable. I still ask myself whether I should have told them or not. Keeps me up some nights. For quite some time now, the US and Cuba have had let's call it a tumultuous relationship. Back in 2015, however, the United States government officially reopened their embassy in Havana and sent some of their finest agents and officials to work there. Even though there was still a lot of tension between the two nations, everything appeared to be hunky-dory over at the embassy. That is, until late 2016, when an American CIA operative started hearing a strange, buzzing noise in his apartment. The buzzing caused an uncomfortable feeling of pressure in his head. At first he figured it was cicadas or crickets outside his window, but that turned out not to be the case. The mysterious, insect-like buzzing wouldn't let up, and the agent began suffering from dizziness and chronic headaches. Things got so bad that he sought medical attention. A report was sent to Washington. Since this was just a one-off case, nobody paid it much attention. No investigation was launched into the matter, and business continued as usual. In February 2017, though, 2 more agents reported hearing the same strange buzzing. This time, it caused more serious symptoms. They not only suffered from headaches and dizziness, but also motor issues and tinnitus. Whatever this strange sound was, it only seemed to be affecting US personnel stationed at the Havana embassy, and it was seriously doing a number on their brains. The symptoms were the same as in patients with damaged inner ears. When confronted by the head of the US embassy, the Cuban government denied any wrongdoing. The Americans launched an investigation into both the Cubans and the Russians, but didn't find any evidence to link them to the buzzing sound. By March, even more American personnel came forward with similar symptoms. Motor issues, extreme migraines, vertigo and tinnitus. Some of these personnel didn't even report hearing the buzzing sound at all. They'd just fallen sick out of the blue. They called it Havana Syndrome. As the months went by, more and more Americans stationed in the Cuban capital began to fall prey to it. By September of that same year, 16 CIA agents alone had been affected, along with many other civil servants. A doctor was sent to treat them. He too fell sick. Those affected by Havana Syndrome soon began developing other symptoms. Insomnia, nausea, fainting, vision loss, frequent nosebleeds, and, most worryingly, signs of brain damage. They were struggling with severe memory loss and became unable to concentrate on anything. These cognitive issues were making it difficult for them to complete even simple tasks, and lasted for months after being exposed to the mysterious buzzing sound. Due to the secrecy of the CIA's investigation, we don't know exactly how many staff members were affected by the syndrome, but we do know that at least 40 personnel fell sick. Their brains were examined using advanced imaging techniques. The results of these tests were then compared with the control group. In July of this year, the report was published. The 40 staff members affected by Havana Syndrome had significantly less brain matter than the control group. They also had problems with functional connectivity in their brains. It then came to light that Canadian officials in Havana were being affected too, 14 of them in total. Both the US and Canadian governments were convinced that some sort of radio or electromagnetic weapon was being used to attack their workers, but couldn't pinpoint exactly who was responsible or what sort of device was being used. Both governments withdrew all their non-essential personnel from Havana. the 14 affected Canadians sued their government for $28 million for failing to address the Havana Syndrome problem. Their lawsuit is still ongoing. As of right now, we still don't know who or what was responsible for the buzzing. Some people think that the syndrome was the result of some environmental issue, and that it really was just the constant sound of crickets or cicadas that affected the workers' brains. And that doesn't explain why only US and Canadian government officials were affected though. The whole thing's very suspicious, and theories range from Cuban, Russian or Chinese sabotage to the whole thing simply being an unidentified virus that spread around the embassies. Since it's such a recent phenomenon, we might actually uncover the truth on this one. If the American and Canadian governments don't keep the whole thing secret, that is. It seems they're doing their utmost to keep their investigations under wraps. Understandable, I suppose. For anyone wondering what this mysterious buzzing sounded like, I'm about to play a short recording taken by one of the US agents. Don't worry, the clip isn't long enough to fry your brain. Probably. If you don't want to hear it, pause the video now and use the timestamp in the description to skip to the next entry. For the curious amongst you though, here it is. I'm not sure how well known this one is, but it's one that's always tickled my fancy. The Bath game, sometimes known as Daruma-san, is a game that dates back a long way. The game itself carries with it huge risk, but also the potential for huge reward. According to legend, by conducting a simple ritual, you can summon an entity known as Daruma-san, who will play a game of cat and mouse with you. The reward for winning is that you'll be blessed with amazing fortune. This one's not for the light-hearted amongst you though, as a lot of bad things can happen to you if you decide to play the game, including death. Here are the rules. To play, you'll need a bathroom with a bathtub. Only one person can play this game at a time, but don't worry, you won't really be playing alone. Step 1. Wait until nighttime, just before bed. Step 2. Fill up your bath with water and turn off all the lights. Step 3. Take off your clothes and get into the bath. Make sure your body is facing the faucet. Step 4. Close your eyes and begin to wash your hair. Step 5. As you wash your hair, repeat the phrase, Daruma-san fell down. Daruma-san fell down. Make sure to keep repeating this the whole time you wash. Under no circumstances should you open your eyes. Step 6. If everything's gone according to plan, your head will be filled with the mental image of a woman standing in the bathtub. In this mental image, she'll slip and fall face first onto the tap, gouging out her right eye. She'll die in the process. Step 7. If, after this mental image, you feel a presence in the water behind you, do not turn around or open your eyes. Instead, ask aloud, why did you fall? Step 8. There'll be no answer to your question. Just let it linger in the air for a moment. Then, with your eyes still firmly shut, step out of the bath and dry yourself off. And this can be dangerous, so be careful not to slip as you get out. Step 9. You can now open your eyes. Head to your bedroom. It's time for bed. Do not turn on the bathroom lights. Do not drain the bath water until morning. Do not re-enter the bathroom after you leave, and make sure to close the door behind you. Step 10. Go to sleep. The ritual is now complete. As soon as you wake up in the morning, the game will begin. The ghostly figure of Daruma-san will follow you all day. You can tell who she is by her stained white clothes, her long black hair, and the fact that she's missing her right eye. Her left one is open and bloodshot. Throughout the day, you'll occasionally feel her presence creeping up behind you. When you do, quickly look over your right shoulder. When you turn to look, you probably won't see her. As the day goes on though, she'll get closer and closer. Do not let her touch you. If you sense that she's getting too close, shout, "Tomare," meaning stop. Shout this while swinging your arm in a chopping motion. Then, run. You've just stalled her and bought yourself some time. Put as much distance between you and her as possible. Use this Tomare command sparingly though. It'll become less effective with every use, so only say it when you really feel the need to. The game will only end when you manage to catch a glimpse of Daruma over your right shoulder. When you finally do see her, immediately shout, "Kita," meaning I cut you loose. Say this while swinging your arm like before. If you manage to do that before midnight, congratulations, you've won the bath game, and good fortune should be yours, for a time at least. Should you fail to spot her by midnight and cut her loose though, then I'm afraid you've lost the bath game. Daruma will never stop following you. You can run as much as you like, but she'll always be close behind, and eventually you'll need to sleep, giving her the opportunity to catch you, either in person or in your dreams. When she catches you, well, that's the end. Don't try to play this game more than once. On the second playthrough, she'll start at the same distance you caught sight of her last time, and you won't have enough time in the morning to get away. This was back in the 80s. I lived in Australia and was driving from Brisbane to Sydney. I had a Jimi Hendrix bobblehead on the dashboard of my truck. We'd recently had a Secret Santa at the new company I was working at, and a co-worker bought it for me as a gift. Why she'd picked that out for me was anyone's guess. I guess I was a newbie, and she didn't really know me that well, so maybe she thought it might be a funny present. I don't know. I wasn't actually a Hendrix fan. I was more into disco music myself, but obviously I didn't tell her that. She was cute though, and on the off chance that she might one day get inside my vehicle, I decided to put the bobblehead on my dashboard. On that drive to Sydney, I noticed a hitchhiker on the side of the road. Well, this was the 80s, when this sort of thing was more acceptable and viewed as less of a big deal, so I decided to help the guy out and give him a ride. He looked normal enough. The guy hops in and thanks me, says that he's heading in the same direction. As we made our way towards Sydney, the guy points out to the Hendrix bobblehead on my dash. "Hey man, you're a fan of Jimi Hendrix, huh? He's the greatest guitarist of all time, am I right?" The dude starts getting seriously passionate about Jimi Hendrix, and starts going off about him so much that I can't get a word in edgeways. He seemed like such a big fan of Jimi Hendrix, that when he asked me, "So you're really into his music too, huh?" I just replied with, "Yeah, I'm a big fan." Didn't want to ruin the guy's buzz, you know? "Wow, that's awesome, man. Which songs?" "Oh, you know, all of them, man. Couldn't pick one in particular." In all honesty, I couldn't actually think of a single song title. The hitchhiker gives me a big smile. "Right on," he says. He spent the rest of the journey smiling and looking out of the window, as if he was contemplating something. We start to get close to Sydney. That's when he says that we're near where he needs to be dropped off. He points me down some side road that took us off the beaten track. I pull up where he tells me. The place looks deserted. No buildings around, no people. Real Nowheresville. Why did he want to be dropped off here of all places? He hopped out of my vehicle. "Thanks for the ride, man," he says to me. "Yeah, don't mention it. It was good to have some company." "Hey, I'm gonna be honest with you," he said. He dipped his hand into his waistband and pulled out a pistol. "I was gonna end you, man. Right here, right now. Just take your money and run, you know. But I can't do that to a Hendrix fan, man. Not to a Hendrix fan." I had no idea if this was some kind of sick joke or what, but his weapon looked real enough to me. I knew I had to say something, but all I could muster was, thanks for not going through with it, I guess." With that, he strolled off to who knows where. Didn't wait around to see. Just floored it out of there. Not too long after that, the guy's face showed up in a newspaper I was reading. He was facing charges for slaying a middle-aged man that had picked him up while he was hitchhiking. Could have easily been me, had my co-worker not picked me as Secret Santa, and not bought me that stupid bobblehead. This isn't my story, but my friend's. His name is Morita, and though he's not the purest of people, I don't think he deserved what happened to him. Still, I won't sugarcoat things, and I'll let you guys judge for yourselves. This all happened 5 years ago. Morita and I both lived in Osaka, Kansai. We met at university, though at the time of this story, Morita had already been working at an accounting firm for the past 2 years. He'd done well for himself. I was stuck making okonomiyaki for tourists. Not an awful job per se, but I always thought I'd be working for a big firm like him. I envied him a little. Anyway, Morita had to go away for a week to audit some company in Hiroshima, a good 6-hour drive away from Osaka. As such, his company paid for him to stay in a hotel there for a week. When he came back, we met up for dinner. "Hey man," he told me, "I have a crazy story to share with you." "Oh yeah?" I said, urging him to spill the beans. "Yeah, I met a girl down in Hiroshima on my first night. Had myself a little holiday romance, if you know what I mean. Yumi, her name was." He proceeded to show me pictures of this Yumi woman on his phone. "She's an accountant too at the company I was auditing." "Dude," I replied, "you already have a girlfriend." "I know, it's a pretty bad thing to do, but it's okay. My girlfriend will never find out." He could tell from my reaction that I was both surprised and disappointed in his behavior. "Man, relax. This was only a 1-week fling. I made sure Yumi knew this was nothing serious, and I won't do anything like this again, believe me." In the end, I promised to keep his secret. A few weeks passed, and I'd arranged to meet up with Morita again for dinner in town. I arrived a little early. When Morita finally arrived, I was shocked by his appearance. He looked pale and disheveled. I knew instantly that something was the matter. "Hey, everything okay, bud?" I asked him. "You'll never believe what's happened," he said, looking like he was about to be sick. He was right. After he told me, I genuinely couldn't believe my ears. It turns out that very day, a new employee had started working at his company. It was the same girl he'd had a fling with in Hiroshima, the Yumi woman. She'd moved all the way to Osaka, transferred her job to his company, and completely uprooted her whole life just so she could be with him. She'd become obsessed. Totally obsessed. "Yumi, what on earth are you doing here?" he asked her. "I came to be with you, silly. I know you said you weren't looking for anything serious, but I know in your heart you didn't mean that. When you stopped replying to my messages, I knew I had to prove to you how serious I was about this relationship." "Relationship?" Morita gasped. "Yumi, I only saw you for a week. We only had a holiday romance. No big deal, you know." He did his best to try and convince her that he didn't have any true feelings for her, but she didn't seem to get the message. Yumi would follow Morita around the office, constantly talking to him and trying to get close to him. When it was time to go home, Morita would quickly run out of the office and out of her view. He knew he couldn't let her find out where he lived. If she'd followed him all the way to where he worked, she'd most certainly turn up at his apartment. She was, after all, a total yandere. Who knows what she might do? After days of trying to get her to leave him alone, he finally confessed to her. "Yumi, I'm sorry, but I already have a girlfriend." "Oh, I see." Her eyes became extremely wide and flared with a sort of fiery intensity. The rest of her face remained neutral. "I understand." With that, she turned her back to him and scurried away into her cubicle. Didn't speak to him for the rest of the day. Well, his actions up until now had been stone cold, but I guess there wasn't really any other way to deal with the situation. At least he'd come clean. Maybe this crazy girl would finally go back home now. And that was for the best, both for Morita and for her. When Morita arrived at work the next morning, Yumi was nowhere to be seen. Excellent, she'd gotten the message. Morita approached his desk and noticed something unusual. There was a chocolate cake next to his computer. Beside it was a post-it note. "Keep up the good work, Morita." Signed, Mr. Ishiguro. Ishiguro was the head of the department. Wow, Morita felt pretty good about himself. He'd obviously impressed his boss and was seen as a major asset to the company. Strange, though, he thought. There was a single slice missing from the cake. Had his boss forgotten to eat breakfast and taken a slice of the cake? Who knew? Whatever the case, he was ecstatic. After lunch, Morita planned on eating a slice of the cake, but the tempura he had filled him up more than he expected. He decided to save the cake for after dinner instead. Before leaving work that day, he happened to bump into his boss. With a bow, he thanked Mr. Ishiguro for the cake. Cake? What on earth are you talking about, Morita? I've never bought cake for an employee in my life. If I was going to start now, I certainly wouldn't give you the first one. What? But if the cake wasn't from Ishiguro, then... Yeah, you already guessed it, right? Morita guessed it too. Yumi had come into the office earlier than anyone else that morning and planted the cake on Morita's desk. She had left the forged note from his boss. She had cut out a piece of the cake for herself to enjoy at home. Here's the crazy part. The icing in the cake had been poisoned. Morita figured that she had probably tampered with the cake in some way, so he disposed of it quickly after he figured it out, but he didn't suspect that she'd have done something so extreme. He only found out what she had actually done with the cake after she didn't turn up to work for several days. People were sent to her apartment to check on her. They found Yumi lifeless on her sofa. She had eaten her piece of the cake, and the icing had done its job. She had left a love note for Morita. It was several pages long. It closed with the lines, "So, if I can't have you in this life, I'll have you in the next. See you there soon, my love. Forever yours, Yumi." If he had still been hungry after lunch that day, he really would have been hers forever. Our actions have consequences, sometimes bigger consequences than we can foresee. Obviously, the story got relayed to Morita's girlfriend, and she dumped him then and there. I hope he'll think twice before doing something so rotten and selfish again. For the past 15 years, I've been delivering groceries in Nebraska. A lot of our customers have been using us for a long time, though this story has to do with one household in particular. For the sake of privacy, we'll call them the Wilson family. For almost the entire time I've worked this job, the Wilson family have been using our delivery service. Once, or sometimes twice a week, I'll drop by their place to deliver their groceries. The mama of the house is called Marie. Her husband was called Tex. I ain't sure if that was his real name or not, but that's what he went by, and the guy was a real modern-day cowboy. Wore the whole get-up, and always addressed me as cowboy. "Morning, cowboy," he'd say as he saw me coming up his driveway. "Catch you later, cowboy," he'd say as I bid him farewell. He always said this while bringing two of his fingers to his head, like a real cowboy would if he was lifting his hat or something. I always returned the gesture. We bonded over the years, and would sometimes get lost in conversation with each other. Real nice guy, Tex was. Didn't have the healthiest of diets, though. I could tell by his shopping cart. Seemed like the guy was living off bacon, sausage, and steak. Sadly, the old man's diet caught up with him in the end, and Tex kicked the bucket 5 years after I started delivering to him. I shed a few tears for the guy the evening I heard the news, and had a drink to his memory. Marie kept on ordering from us after that. For 9 or so years, I kept dropping by her place as usual, this time with a smaller haul of groceries than when Tex was still with us. A lot can change over 9 years, let me tell you. I got to watch as their 2 young sons grew up into teenagers, and as their house changed with the times, as Marie sold Tex's beloved motor car, and as her life went on, and she got married to another guy called Phil. Their haul increased after that, as did the number of deliveries I had to make to their house every week. Recently though, something strange happened when I made one of those deliveries. I came by their house as usual, only to see Tex's old car outside their home, looking just how it had years before, same paint job and everything. Marie must have tracked down the buyer and bought the car back off him. Maybe she was feeling sentimental and wanted to hold on to that piece of Tex after spending so many years without him. Who knows? I knocked on the door and Marie answered. Strange, I thought. Her face seemed distinctly less wrinkled than I remembered. "Mrs. Wilson," I said, "you're positively glowing." She blushed a little and thanked me, then invited me inside to drop the groceries in the kitchen. "Got old Tex's car back, I see," I said to her. She let out a little laugh. "Did he tell you he sold it then? That ugly thing will be with us until he kicks the bucket." I was a tad confused by her reply, but brushed it off and put it down to the old woman's brain going a little gaga with years. Something else seemed a little weird though. The decor of the house. It was like it had been years ago. Old photos were strung up on the wall of the kids when they were much younger. All of the furniture was like the stuff they used to have in the past. My mind started darting around. Had she dumped Phil? Gone a little doolally or something? Was she trying to relive the old days when she was with Tex? I daren't ask. Didn't want to cause any drama. I walked into the kitchen to put down the groceries. Sitting at the table, eating their breakfast, were Marie's 2 sons. But that's the thing. They weren't teenagers. They were just kids again, like how they looked in all the old photos on the wall. Impossible, I thought. They must just be her nephews or something. She was just babysitting some relative's kids. But they looked so identical. They could have been clones of her children from the past. I put down the groceries and immediately made my way to the front door, not stopping to chat with Marie. Something felt off about the house. I didn't like it. I needed some air. "Leaving so quickly?" she said as I speed walked to the front door. "Yes," I managed to spurt out. "Sorry, I'm in a rush today. Have a good one, Mrs. Wilson." I reached the front door, which was still open, but something made me stop. I can't describe the feeling, but I knew I had to turn and look over my right shoulder, past it into the living room behind me. I trusted my instinct and turned my head. Sat there in an old, familiar armchair was an old, familiar man. "Catch you next time, cowboy," he said to me, raising 2 fingers to his head. A strange feeling came over me. Not fear. Warmth. I'd recognize that face anywhere. I gave Tex a smile and raised my 2 fingers out of respect. I then walked out the front door and closed it behind me. I looked out onto their driveway. Tex's old car was nowhere to be seen. Nothing seemed out of place or old-fashioned. Everything was as it should be. Back to normal. Back like it was in my time. I continued on with the rest of my deliveries for the day. I've made many deliveries to Marie since then, and nothing else weird has ever happened to me at that house. I decided not to tell her about the incident, fearing that she'd think I was making fun of her or insulting Tex's memory in some way. I've told my wife and friends about it. They all called me crazy, so I'm sharing my story here. Does anyone have any ideas about what this could have been? I've been racking my head for months now, and still can't think of a rational explanation. Did I experience a time warp? A brain spasm? Some sort of glitch in the Matrix? I have no idea, but I was completely lucid. Didn't have anything weird in my system, and saw and heard everything plain as day. I don't know what to make of all of this, but I will say, Tex, It was good to see you again, cowboy. It was summer in small-town New Mexico. I was about 15 years old at the time, and since school was out, I was doing a few odd jobs around town to earn some money. Mowing lawns, walking dogs, anything that could make me a few bucks, you know. There was this one guy who lived in my town, an older gentleman in his early 70s, Mr. Lesnar. He used to be a teacher at my school, but I hadn't seen him for at least a year. He was bald, with a big white beard. Put a red suit on the guy and he could have passed as a mall Santa. I always remembered him as being a nice, friendly guy, so when I bumped into him in town, I asked if there was anything he needed help with. He said there was. He needed help reorganizing a few parts of his house, said that he'd pay me $50 if I helped him. When you're 15 years old, having $50 in your pocket feels like being a millionaire. I took him up on it. The next day rolled around, and I went over to Mr. Lesnar's house and knocked on the door. He answered with a smile on his face and invited me inside. First thing that struck me was the stench. His house had that old person smell about it. I didn't know much about the guy, to be honest. I mean, yeah, he used to teach at my school, but all I really remembered about him was how he always wore socks with sandals, and how he always spent every school vacation down in Mexico. I started off by cleaning up in the kitchen. Once I'd finished, Mr. Lesnar told me that he wanted help boxing up some things in the basement. Said he had too much junk down there, and that he wanted to reorganize and get rid of a load of it. Told me to start boxing things up, and to come and tell him when I'd finished. There must have been a set of 12 stairs that led down into this strangely large, stale-smelling basement. Mr. Lesnar flicked the light switch. A lone, dusty light bulb illuminated the basement. I grabbed a few folded-up cardboard boxes and made my way down. So, there I was, just boxing all sorts of things up in this grungy basement. Must have spent about 45 minutes down there by myself. While I was working, I happened to lean against a particular spot on the wall. When I leant on it, I came across something odd. A loose panel in the basement wall. Not a broken part of the wall, mind you. I mean, this panel was intentionally loose. Well, curiosity got the better of me, and I started fumbling with it. It came right off. Behind the panel was a small compartment. Hidden inside that compartment was a box. It felt like finding a hidden treasure chest. I checked to see if Mr. Lesnar was standing behind me at the top of the stairs. The coast was clear. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I pulled out the box. I lifted off the top, curious to see what the old man was hiding inside. At first, it didn't look like there was much in it. A journal, a few knickknacks, and a small pile of photographs, maybe 10 or 12 in total. I took out the photos. My heart immediately sank after looking at the top one. At first, I could hardly believe the image. It showed Mr. Lesnar with a pistol in his hand, kneeling down next to a dead woman lying in the dirt. Her lifeless eyes were staring into the camera lens. She was clearly Mexican and had obviously been shot. The second photo was almost identical, only this time it was a male who stared lifelessly at the camera. No, this can't be real, I thought. I flicked through all the pictures, every damn one, each one telling the same story. They all showed Lesnar, knelt down next to some bloody human game, sprawled out on the ground in front of him. All of the victims varied wildly in age. There was writing on the backs of all the photos, but it was all in Spanish, and I couldn't make it out. Still, I knew instantly what this was. A box full of sick mementos from Lesnar's trips to Mexico, hidden away from the world in a small wall compartment. In some photos, Lesnar looked younger. In others, he appeared to be in his mid-60s. In all of them, he was kneeling down next to his victims, with the same disturbing grin on his face, posing like a hunter with his trophies. I was overcome by this weird mixture of shock, disgust, anger, and, most of all, fear. Fear that I was in the basement of the monster in these photos. Without thinking, I shoved the images back inside the box and slid the container back into the wall. I desperately fumbled with the wall panel, trying to put it back in the exact same way it was, not wanting the old man to realize that I'd discovered his horrible secret. I'd just about got the damn thing back in place when I heard a creaking at the top of the basement stairs behind me. I turned to see old man Lesnar standing by the basement door, looking down at me. I have never felt more like a rat in a cage. "Looks like you're doing a good job," he said. My heart skipped a beat. I just mumbled something and tried to act like nothing was wrong. "Oh, don't mind me. I'm just going upstairs for a nap. You keep on going down there." With that, he slowly turned and walked off through the hallway. There was maybe 20 seconds of silence before I heard his footsteps making their way up the stairs to his bedroom. My mind was racing. Had he seen me fiddling with the panel? Did he know that I'd found his photos? Oh God, was I in danger? I was only a scrawny kid. I decided not to stay down there wondering. I waited for a few moments before bolting up the basement staircase. I dashed towards the front door, grabbed the handle and twisted. No good. The damn thing had been locked from the inside. I figured the old man had just locked it before he went upstairs. I scanned the door to see if there was a way to quickly open it. No time. I could hear movements above me. The old man was walking back out of his bedroom and towards the stairs. I sprinted through the hallway and into the kitchen. I knew from the cleaning earlier there was a back door there. I grabbed the handle and prayed. With a twist, it flung open. It felt like winning the lottery. I flew out of that house, ran around the property and back onto the main street. I looked back only once. When I did, I saw the old man's face in one of the downstairs windows. He looked to be holding something. I was too far away to make out what it was exactly, but I bet you can guess what I thought it was. From there, I kept on running until I got home, thankful that the old man lived in a cul-de-sac and not in the middle of nowhere. If he did, I'm certain he'd have taken a shot at me. It goes without saying that I told my parents what I'd found. We notified the authorities about it, and I told them about the secret panel and the sick mementos in the box. When they checked the place out, they did indeed find the secret compartment. Predictably, it was totally empty. There was no box hidden inside, no evidence of any wrongdoing whatsoever. They figured I was just messing with the old guy or something, and decided not to look into him any further. I don't know what Lesnar did with the pictures, whether he destroyed them or hid them elsewhere, but he got away with it all regardless. Old man Lesnar lived another 8 years after that. In that time, I graduated high school, went off to college, and moved out of town. My parents always lived in that same place, however. For all the time I lived there after that incident, and whenever I'd go back to visit my parents, I'd always be looking over my shoulder. I knew that Mr. Lesnar wanted to take his secret to the grave, and I always worried that he'd try and silence me to do so. It's hard to believe there are people like this, who, to the outside world, are leading seemingly ordinary lives. I'm glad I didn't become his last trophy. Lenny Derrickson was your typical 39-year-old family man living in Oklahoma. One Saturday morning in 1998, he was eating breakfast with his son. Suddenly, an unknown man pulled up outside their farm in a white pickup truck. Lenny went out to greet the man. His son, Jared, remained inside and watched as his father chatted with the stranger. According to Jared, the unknown man was about 40 years old, stood over 6 feet tall, was white with a full red beard, and was wearing a t-shirt with the slogan, "No Fear," printed on it. He couldn't hear what the two of them were talking about, but their conversation appeared to be friendly, and it didn't set off any alarm bells. When Lenny came back into the house, he told his son that the man wanted to buy one of his family's stud horses that he'd advertised in the paper. Lenny told his son that he was going to go and show the man the horse, which he kept on a separate property, and that Jared should stay behind and feed the cows. Said that he'd be back in the afternoon. Well, afternoon rolled around, and Lenny still hadn't returned home. He never would. Lenny was reported missing the next day. Investigators found that Lenny had left an uncashed paycheck at home. They also learned that Lenny had never placed an ad for his horse in the paper after all. He had lied to his son. But why? They searched the property where Lenny kept his stud horses. He had never arrived there on the day he went missing. There was no evidence of foul play, no body, nothing else to go on. So, what happened to Lenny? Well, there are two possibilities. Either the mysterious stranger was responsible for his disappearance in some way, or he ran off on his own accord. His family are adamant that Lenny would have never abandoned them. Lenny was extremely close with his son, Jared. They spent almost all of their time together. There's no way that he just upped and left him behind. With that being said, Lenny was struggling financially at the time he vanished. It's possible he decided to start a new life somewhere else. If he did, what did the mysterious stranger have to do with it all? There have been 2 reported sightings of Lenny since he disappeared. At 9 AM on the morning he went missing, a waitress at a local coffee shop saw Lenny talking with an unknown man. According to her, Lenny sat there drinking coffee while he just listened to the man talk. All efforts to track down this unknown man have failed. The second supposed sighting happened 6 months later in a bar in Amarillo, Texas. An anonymous caller phoned the cops and told them that Lenny was at the bar with him. By the time the authorities arrived to investigate, both Lenny and the unknown caller were gone. So, did Lenny run away to start a new life elsewhere? Had he been living a double life the entire time? Did he get involved with some sort of criminal network as a way to dig himself out of his financial debt? Did he disappear to protect his family? Does he want to be found or not? Did something more sinister happen to him after all? All questions that remain unanswered. The speed painting visuals used in this episode were created by Victoria Skeller. Links to her YouTube channel and Instagram can be found in the description. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, born and raised, and I have my own story to share here. One that's equal parts bizarre and disturbing. Around 4 years ago, I was walking through one of the local parks early in the morning, well before anyone else was up and awake. I'd just broken up with my long-term girlfriend and was having difficulty sleeping. As I strolled through the empty park, I heard something that caught my attention. A soft whimpering. Sheltered under a tree on my left was a dog, a black Labrador to be precise. The poor thing must have gotten lost, I thought. I leant down to pet the little guy, and his tail immediately started wagging like crazy. He licked my hand and made it clear that, like me, he was in need of a friend. No collar, nor anything else to suggest he had an owner. What was he doing out here all by himself? Had somebody kicked him out? Was he a stray? I stood up and walked a few steps to look around for his owner, but the dog wouldn't leave me alone. He was like my shadow. Wherever I walked, he followed. Together, we walked the length and breadth of that park. Occasionally, I called out, "Hello? Hello? I have your dog here." But there was nobody around at all. No one was looking for the poor fella. I looked down at him and stared into his big brown eyes, a pair that said, "Please, take me with you." It seemed like the universe had thrown the two of us together. This dog was the answer to my newfound loneliness, and I was the answer to his. I took him home with me. For a long time, I did my best to track down his owner. I reported the dog as missing and put up flyers around town, but nobody ever got in contact with me. It looked like I'd found myself a new canine housemaid. I named him Scooby. Creative, I know. Every morning, I'd take Scooby for a long walk. The first week I had him, we walked the exact same route around town. Thing is, every time we came to pass this one particular house, Scooby would stop and start crying. I'd try and pull him away, try to get him to keep going, but he'd just stare at the house and whine like crazy. Each time we came to pass that house, it'd take me a good 10 minutes to get him to continue on with me, tugging on his leash the entire time. After the 6th or 7th time we passed that house, it became clear to me that he was going to do this every time. So, in the end, I just decided to switch up our walking route. I had no idea what got into him, or why that house seemed to bother him so much. It wasn't like he was crying to go inside. He never tugged on his leash to get closer. It was more like he was afraid of something in there, but couldn't bring himself to leave, like a human who can't look away from a deadly accident. He had some sort of strange, doggy fascination with the place. Anyway, for the next 6 months I owned Scooby, I took him on several different walking routes, making sure that we never passed that damn house that freaked him out so much. One day though, I had an early morning errand to run, which took me past that house. I decided to take Scooby along with me, get his daily walk out of the way, completely forgetting about how he acted 6 months earlier. Well, Scooby hadn't forgotten about that house. Not by a long shot. As we came to pass it, he once again froze in place and refused to move. He whimpered loudly, refusing to take his eyes off the place. "Come on, Scoob, there's a good boy," I said to him, trying to calm him down and coax him along a bit. It didn't work. He seemed more unsettled by that house than he ever had been before. "Hey, what's gotten into you, boy?" I asked him rhetorically. He must have stayed like that for a good 15 minutes this time, just staring and crying, refusing to budge. Then, without warning, he bolted towards the house, pulling his leash right out of my hands. "Scooby!" I shouted. "Get back here!" It was no use. Whatever fear had consumed him before, he had conquered it. He rushed to that house, ran around the corner and into the backyard. God damn it, Scooby, I thought. The owners must have a cat or something. That's why he always acts crazy around here. I chased Scooby into the house's backyard, completely embarrassed, praying that I could get him out of there before the owners woke up and started cussing me out. I got back there and found Scooby frantically digging a hole in the grass. I'd never seen him acting like this before. He never dug holes in my backyard. I tried to pull him away, but he just shook me off and kept digging, his little paws throwing up earth left, right, and center. I was furious with him. But, you see, Scooby knew something I didn't. Knew a secret that nobody else knew. He knew what was buried in that yard. His former owner. Scooby's digging unearthed the largely decomposed corpse of a 32-year-old man, shallowly buried in the garden of your average suburban house in North Carolina. The man had been down there for as long as I'd had Scooby. The authorities were alerted, and an investigation began. Turns out the house was a rental. The dead man had been living there with his girlfriend and their dog. All their neighbors and their friends in the area knew them as Jim and Charlotte. These turned out to be fake identities. Everything people thought they knew about their lives and their pasts were a lie. The inside of their house remained untouched. Nothing appeared to have been taken. As of right now, the police still haven't been able to track down the so-called Charlotte. She remains the prime suspect for his killing, though nobody's really sure if she was behind it all and went on the run, or if she herself was a victim too, buried somewhere else by somebody else. If she was responsible, then she left in a damn hurry, as pretty much all her personal possessions were still inside the house. Her wallet, her fake ID, everything but her cell phone. Whatever the case, no one has ever come forward to reveal either Jim or Charlotte's real identities. No friends, no family, no one. As such, Jim was reburied here in Nashville and given an unnamed headstone. The strangest part in my eyes is that the house's rent was still being paid when the body was found, despite the fact it had been empty for 6 months. The landlord had always been paid in cash, which arrived in an envelope through the mail. It was always addressed from Jim, even after his demise. So, the question is, who was still paying the rent? Charlotte, the girlfriend? Someone else who didn't want the new tenants to be digging around in the garden? That all remains unclear. I'm sure there are details the cops haven't revealed to the public, but still, it's a little weird. Scooby is still around to this day. He still cries whenever we go past that house, but he doesn't stop and stare anymore. In his own way, I like to think he found a little closure. I don't know how his last owner treated him or what he was like, but Scooby didn't want to leave him down there in the ground. He's a good boy. I'll update you all if they ever find the woman. At the time of this story, I was a 23-year-old woman living in Charleston, South Carolina. I know the way I phrase that makes it sound like I'm not a woman anymore. I am, but anyway, this is my story. I worked as a paralegal at one of the small law firms in town, and 5 days a week during my lunch hour, I'd head off to the same Starbucks near my workplace to grab a coffee. My job was actually pretty repetitive, and so was my lunchtime routine. Most people's are, I suppose. That's why I'd always see the same faces in the coffee shop, day in and day out. It was like a little microcosm. The same baristas were always there too. There was this one guy who worked there every weekday. According to his tag, his name was Randall. He was about 6 foot tall, average build, had very short, ginger hair, a crew cut I guess you'd call it. No Prince Charming, but not entirely unattractive either. Just a guy who kinda blended in. You know how at Starbucks they ask for your name to write on the cups? Well, the first few times Randall took my order, he asked me for mine. Stephanie, I'd say. He saw me so frequently that I guess he just committed my name to memory after that. Every day I'd approach the counter, and every day Randall would take my order. No name required. He'd just jot it down on the cup without asking. After a couple of weeks of this, however, Randall started flirting with me, I suppose. Not verbally, but through his writing on the cup. He started drawing little hearts over the I in my name, and sometimes even drew some after my name as well. Bear in mind, I'd never actually spoken to this guy. Well, other than giving him my order. No friendly chit-chat or anything. I mean, I was flattered and all, but I wasn't interested. The strange part is every time I went in there, he had never tried to talk to me more than just taking my order, and never addressed the fact that he was adding these flirty touches to his writing. In fact, he never showed any kind of emotion on his face whatsoever. No smiles, no eyebrow movement, kind of a robotic guy. You'd have thought this was his build-up to asking me out or something, but nope. He just acted professional at the counter, and never said anything apart from, "What would you like?" and "That'll be X dollars 50. Despite that, he kept on adding the little hearts every time he wrote my name down, and over time, he even started adding little kisses after my name. It made things a little uncomfortable for me, but maybe he was just a little odd in the head, and did this to regular customers too. I just accepted it and ignored it. That is, until the day he added his phone number to the cup, along with a little winky face drawn next to it, with a speech bubble saying, "Call me." I immediately went back to Randall at the counter, and quietly and politely turned him down, letting him know that I was flattered, but that now wasn't really a good time for me. Just a little white lie. Like always, his face remained neutral, no emotional response at all. He simply said, "Okay," and averted his eyes. It was very awkward. I usually take my coffee to go, but that particular day, I really speed-walked out of there. From then on, I considered going somewhere else for my coffee, but to be honest, I really liked what I got from Starbucks, and the only other one nearby was an extra 10-minute walk away. I figured we were both adults, and the situation didn't need to be awkward, so I kept going back there. Randall remained stony-faced as always. Luckily, the love hearts on the coffee cup stopped after that, and things went back to being normal. Time passed, and one weekend, I agreed to go on a lunch date with another guy I met. We both had super busy schedules, but worked near each other and had the same time slots for lunch, so it made sense for us to have a mini 1-hour coffee and conversation. We agreed that the Starbucks would be a nice, casual spot. I forgot to consider the whole Randall situation entirely. I got there, and the guy I'm meeting's already found a table. I go over and give him a hug. He asks me what I'd like to drink, and like a gentleman, goes up to the counter to order. I sit, waiting at the table. When he comes back with the coffees, my date says to me, "Damn, the guy who took my order has a real attitude problem." I turn to see who he's talking about. Standing by the register, glaring at the both of us, was Randall. He had a look of intense anger on his face, like a person who's just been betrayed. This was the only time I'd ever seen any kind of emotion from the guy at all. Yeah, he didn't even ask me what I wanted, just stared at me angrily and snatched the money right out of my hand. Some people, huh? Annoyingly, we couldn't take our coffees to go, as they came in mugs and not takeout cups. We just sat there, trying to have a normal date. All the while, Randall continued to glare at us from the counter, only looking away briefly when someone came up to order. After the most awkward date of my life thanks to Randall, the two of us got up, said that we'd be in contact, and went back to our respective workplaces. I'd like to say that Randall was just an awkward and harmless guy. I'd like to say that this is where the story ends. But, on both counts, I'd be lying. That same night, I was sat alone in my apartment watching TV, thinking about work, my awkward date, the bills I had to pay, and life in general. All of a sudden, there's a frantic knocking on my front door. I got up and peered through the peephole. On the other side was Randall.
"Is he in there with you?"
What the hell? What was he doing here? Better question, how did he know where I lived?
"I know you're in there. I know he's there too. Well, answer me."
I was terrified and confused. Randall, what on earth are you talking about? Go away! The door handle rattled as he tested it from the other side. Luckily, I'd locked the thing when I got home. Then, slam, he threw the full weight of his body against my door. The damn psycho was trying to break in. Another slam, and then another. My door bounced with every thud against it. From there, autopilot took over me. I grabbed a knife from my kitchen area and ran into the bathroom at the other end of my apartment. I locked myself in there and called the cops. From all the noise he was making, I'm sure a few of my neighbors did too. None of them came out to stop him though, and I can't say I blame them. Randall was slamming on my front door for a good 10 minutes before it gave way. Luckily, it was quite sturdy, and he was no superstar athlete. I could hear him in my apartment though, and I tried to muffle my fear as I hid in my locked bathroom. Thankfully, the police arrived shortly after he broke in. I could hear them telling him to freeze. But when my heart really sank, when it really hit the floor, was when I heard one of the officers shout something I didn't expect to hear. "Drop the weapon." As it turns out, Randall had come with a gun in his hand. Before coming to my place, he'd broken into another house in a different part of Charleston, namely, the house of my date from earlier. He'd smashed a window, crawled inside, and trashed the place. Didn't take anything, but he didn't go there to steal. Luckily, my date wasn't home that night. He was out with his buddies. Randall then came to my place, thinking that was where my date was. He figured we were an item. Turns out Randall had been stalking me for months, always keeping his distance, watching from the shadows. He'd become obsessed. Because I lived such a routine existence and I was so predictable, it was easy for him to track me. He followed me on his time off, and, by his own admission, would stand outside my apartment complex at night, looking up at my window, thinking about coming up to surprise me. Before that night, he decided that would be too creepy. At least he had some sense, I guess. Randall got time. 5 years for his threatening behaviour. Not long enough in my book, but at least I won't be seeing him at Starbucks anymore. I also got a restraining order for when he gets out, and switched firms and apartments to keep him from finding me. Still, what if my date had been home that night? What if the police didn't arrive as quickly as they did? I'm not sure I want to know the answers to those questions. He never actually hurt anyone, and the prosecutors couldn't prove that he had evil intent, so I can kind of understand why the judge gave him such a short sentence. But I know in my heart that he came to kill. Now all I want is to never see Randall again. It was the 18th of June, 1982. The setting was the Imperial gas station in Harrisonburg. On the graveyard shift that night was 20-year-old Kelly Berg Dove, a loving mother, daughter, wife and friend by all accounts. Kelly was very family-oriented, and since her family was a little strapped for cash, she took the job at the gas station to help pay the bills. Her 3 sisters also worked at the same gas station, and on that fateful night, she agreed to trade shifts with one of them. Little did she realize in doing so, she had just sealed her own fate. At around 11 PM, Kelly's mother called her daughter to check everything was going okay. At that point, everything was peachy. That would all change in the next few hours. The whole incident played out in 2-minute segments. At 2:27 AM, Kelly made a call to the Harrisonburg Police Department. She said that she was being harassed by a customer, a man who she described as improperly dressed. What she meant by that remains unclear. 2 minutes passed, and at 2:29, Kelly made another call to the police, this time asking for an officer to come to the gas station. She said that the man was now somewhere outside the station, and that he was calling her and making obscene remarks. At 2:31, Kelly made her third and final call to the cops, this time pleading that they send somebody. She said that the man was now outside the gas station, lurking in a silver or grey vehicle. Finally, at 2:33, the authorities arrived. Despite arriving a mere 2 minutes after Kelly's third and final call, they were still too late. Kelly was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, and nothing had been taken. Kelly's purse and a magazine that she was reading were still on the counter. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. Unfortunately, the police did a terrible job at securing the crime scene. They failed to dust for fingerprints or even search for any possible evidence. The store wasn't even close to the public. Theories about what happened to Kelly abound. One thing to note is that Harrisonburg is located along the I-81, a route infamous for human trafficking due to it being a more rural alternative to the heavily monitored I-95. As such, this could have been a crime of opportunity. Some lowlife may have spotted the vulnerable Kelly all by herself and decided to strike. Kelly has since been declared dead by her family, despite nobody being found and her case remaining unsolved. Nobody knows exactly what happened to her that night, nor do they know the location of her final resting place. The only thing that is certain is that the police really messed up on this one, and as a result, her abductor will likely never be known or brought to justice. This is an allegedly true story that happened to my friend in Japan. He told me this story a long time ago, and the exact location escapes my mind, but he relayed this story to me with so much conviction that I can't help but believe he was telling me the truth. What I do know is this incident definitely resulted in 2 deaths, and he himself had to be questioned by police over and over. It all happened when my friend and 6 of his co-workers at his part-time job were driving in the Chugoku region, the westernmost region of Japan's main island, Honshu. They were driving out to see a suspension bridge. The 7 of them were split up into 2 cars. My friend was the driver of the second car and had 4 passengers with him. In the first car, which was driving ahead of them, were the manager and a couple. Although they set off in the morning, Due to the many stops they had to make along the way, the sun was already setting by the time they made it to the bridge. The suspension bridge ran across a very deep valley in the middle of a mountain. As they approached it, the sky began to drizzle, and fog began swirling around them. There was an open space just in front of the bridge. If the weather had been good, they would have just parked their cars there and crossed the bridge by foot. Then they would have come back. The other side of the bridge was a dead end, and the structure had simply been left there for sightseeing purposes. The moment the first car reached the open space, however, it came to an abrupt stop. Seeing this, my friend hit the brakes, and the second car came to a screeching halt about 10 meters behind the first. "What are they doing?" my friend asked his co-workers in the second car. They had no clue as to why the manager had stopped. For some time, those in the second car just sat there looking on. A few minutes passed, and the first car made no attempt to move, so my friend reached for his door handle. He was going to hop out and see what was going on. Right at the same time, the couple who were in the back seat of the first car suddenly jumped out in unison. Something wasn't right about their expressions. Alarmed, my friend too got out of his car and tried to walk over to them and ask what had happened. But the couple, with their hands joined, started sprinting, and in a flash, they climbed over the guardrail at the edge of the open space and threw themselves over the other side, down into the valley. The four of them in the second car were completely astounded. They all rushed to the guardrail and looked down into the valley below, but because of all the fog, they couldn't see anything at the bottom. None of them could believe what had just happened, and they all stood there in a daze. Soon, they remembered that the manager was still in the car, and they rushed to check on him. The manager was still sat in the driver's seat, his hands grasping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Under his breath, he kept muttering the same phrase over and over. "Mustn't go. Mustn't go. Mustn't go." He wouldn't respond to them. There was nothing else they could do but call the police. The authorities soon arrived on the scene, and the delirious manager was taken away in an ambulance. As you can imagine, the couple who jumped over the side of the mountain were later found dead at the bottom. The rest of the group had to endure a seemingly endless interrogation by the police. In the end, with no evidence of foul play and nothing to go on, the police concluded that the pair had simply decided to end their lives together. My friend later paid a visit to the manager at the hospital. Fortunately, he seemed to be back to normal. He asked him what happened that day at the suspension bridge. Why did he stop the car so suddenly? The manager told him that as they drew near the bridge, a girl dressed in an old-fashioned kimono appeared out of the fog in front of their vehicle. The startled manager immediately hit the brakes. The girl wore her hair short and was dressed like somebody from a historical drama, or maybe even someone from the Meiji period. Of course, this creeped him out, and he wondered if maybe she needed help. But before he could react, he noticed that his car was now surrounded by a whole group of children, all dressed in a similar fashion to the girl. Being a superstitious man, the manager sensed that he was in danger, and quickly began chanting a mantra. According to him, the children who surrounded the car all joined their hands together and started singing "Kagome, Kagome," the bird in the cage. At the same time, the manager heard the children's voices in his head, saying, "Come with us, come with us." The manager gripped the steering wheel and began chanting, "Mustn't go, mustn't go." Next thing he knew, the couple in the back seat behind him flew out of the car, joined their hands with the children, and, together, they all started running towards the guardrails. Of course, the police didn't believe my story, the manager told my friend. Hell, I'm not even sure I believe it myself. You don't have to believe my manager's experience, my friend told me. But one thing's for certain. That was indeed how that couple died, and I, for one, do believe him. An interesting thing to point out is about the song Kagome that the children were allegedly singing. Kagome is a children's game in which a group of children hold hands and walk in a circle around another child in the center. While doing so, they chant the Kagome song. Everyone in Japan knows it. When the song stops, the child in the middle tries to name the person standing directly behind them. The song itself has been a subject of much interest due to its mysterious lyrics and ominous tune, and several disturbing theories exist about it. One theory states that in olden times, it wasn't uncommon for poor families to sell their children in order to survive. According to the theory, they would use the Kagome game as a type of ritual to decide which child should be sold. At the end, when the players finish singing the line, "Who stands behind you now?" whichever child stood behind the person at the center would be the one to go. Since this was considered the will of the gods, nobody could dispute the decision.
Recently, something crazy happened here in Anchorage, Alaska. A USB was found lying in the street by some woman. No idea how it got there, but it probably fell out of someone's pocket. Didn't look to be placed there intentionally. The USB was labeled "Homicide at Midtown Marriott." The label wasn't kidding. The USB contained numerous images and videos of a woman's murder. According to the authorities, most of the 39 images showed the lady being beaten and strangled in a hotel room somewhere, then lying face down in a pickup truck. One of the 12 videos on the device showed her being strangled. Using this information, the authorities were able to link the remains of a woman found by the side of the road to the woman in the photos and videos. Though they're very confident that they're the same person, her identity still remains unknown. No one's come forward to ID her. What they were able to find out for sure, though, was the identity of the guy who took her life. The guy who did all this appeared in several of the pictures he took. Guess he was confident he wouldn't be caught out. Not a smart play when you're clumsy with your USB. They were able to link the man in the picture to a guy involved in another investigation. South African Brian Stephen Smith. He was quickly taken into custody. Like I said, this all happened very recently, so we'll see how things pan out from here. I grew up in England, in a small southern town. Lived there my entire life. It's a sleepy place, far from the bustle of London or any other big cities. When I turned 18, however, something bizarre started happening there, and seemingly only happened to me. I started seeing a new face around town, a man who looked to be in his early 40s. His skin was pasty and grey-looking. Big, dark bags hung under his eyes. Even from a distance, I could see that those eyes had a sickly, yellow tinge to them. Honestly, it looked like the guy hadn't slept in years. You know how some people just have that unsettling vibe about them? Well, this guy certainly had it in spades. Now, when I say I started seeing him around town, I mean I encountered him everywhere, all the time, at least once every day or two. Sometimes I'd get on a bus, and he'd be there, sat at the back. Sometimes I'd be in a store, only to look out the window and see him looking in at me. No matter where I saw him, he'd always be staring at me with those wide, sickly, tired eyes. He never came up to me or said anything. He'd just stay at a distance, examining me, I guess. After staring at me for a few seconds or so, he'd always just walk off along the street. I ignored him as best as I could at the start, assuming he was just some new loony who'd moved to my town. We have more than our fair share of weirdos here, believe me. Over time, his presence became more persistent. I'd start seeing the guy twice a day, and he'd stand there, gazing at me for longer and longer periods of time. Eventually, I'd had enough, and decided I was going to tell him to leave me alone.
Whenever I'd go to approach him though, he'd just quickly walk away, usually keeping his eyes on me as he did. Sometimes he'd even walk backwards away from me, keeping his eyes on me the entire time as he disappeared into the crowd. Even on the rare occasions that I'd run after him, I'd always lose him. He'd turn down a side street or an alleyway, and when I went to follow him in, he would already have vanished out of view. It freaked me out that nobody else ever seemed to react to this creepy man in my town. I mean, aside from the tired appearance, he looked ordinary enough, but you'd have thought that a guy staring wide-eyed at a much younger person would have drawn some attention. It never did. It was like he was invisible to everyone except me. I asked my family if they'd ever seen a pale, weird man around town. They never had. After a while, I tried my best to ignore the guy. He was just some harmless old man with a social disability. That's why he always stares at me ominously, I thought. I never saw him around town staring at anyone else, though. I only ever saw the guy when he was staring at me. As the months went by, I started seeing the man less and less. The sightings went from 9 or 10 times a week down to only 5 or 6 times. Then only every other week, every other month. Eventually I stopped seeing him altogether. I figured he'd gotten bored of his little game or whatever he was up to. After not seeing him for a while, I forgot all about him. A few years passed. I was in my early 20s, and I hadn't encountered the man for a long, long time. Well, one night, after I'd been out drinking with my friends at a local pub, I found myself walking home alone. It was sometime around midnight, maybe a little before, maybe a little after, when, out of the blue, the heavens opened, and it started to rain extremely heavily. I rushed to a nearby bus shelter, seeking cover from the rainfall. This was a secluded part of my small town, right on the very edge, so everything was silent, apart from the pounding of raindrops on the ground, and the quiet buzz of the electric orange streetlights that lit my path back home. I sat there in the bus stop, waiting for the rain to ease up, when, from down the path that led to my house, I heard a single set of footsteps thumping against the pavement, kicking up water that had pooled on the ground. Whoever was approaching me was humming a quiet, slow-paced song to themselves. I didn't recognize the tune. Just another person on their way home from a night out, I thought. Probably drunk. Wait, there aren't any pubs or bars in that direction. The soaked figure stepped under the orange light near my bus shelter, and I could finally make out his face. It was the man I had seen years before, the same dark bags hanging under his eyes. He moved under the same shelter as me, stopped right in front of me, and turned to face me. I was overcome by a strange sense of calm that I've never felt before as I heard him speak for the first time. "I'm sorry about before. I made a mistake. The timing wasn't right." I sat there, listening intently. "It's never happened before, so I thought about taking you out of term for my ego's sake. But that wouldn't have been right. So I just wanted to tell you. I'll be waiting." "What will you be waiting for?" I asked. "Next time, we'll meet under different circumstances. You'll be older. I'll be younger. I'm not sure if you'll recognize me." I stared at him with a blank expression, not sure how to interpret his words. He just smirked at me. "It's okay. You won't see me coming anyway." With that, his face softened for the first time. He dug his hands deep into his pockets, stepped out from under the shelter, back into the pouring rain, and continued on down the street in the opposite direction he approached me from. He kept walking until he was out of sight. The rain stopped 2 minutes later. The strangeness of the encounter finally struck me. I don't know why it hadn't before. I rushed home and double-locked all my doors. Since that night, I've yet to see the man around my town again. I still live there, though I've been planning on moving for a while now. The place just has this weird aura about it ever since that night.
I have no idea if this guy was just some lunatic who likes to play sick games on people, or if he's something even more sinister. To this day, I'm still waiting for him. Recently, a buddy of mine was clearing out some old house that had been abandoned for years. While inside the attic, he came across a USB which really stood out to him. Everything else in the house was old and decrepit, but the USB was obviously modern, not from the same time as all the other stuff in there. Like somebody, other than the previous homeowners, had come in and left it there. Hammerman, or one word, was written on it. Nothing else seemed out of place or unordinary. For whatever reason, he decided to pocket the thing and take it home with him. After he looked at what was on the flash drive, he called me up and invited me around to his place. Said he had something I had to see. Now, together, we sat looking at his computer screen as he opened up the USB drive. There was just one large file stored on it. A video. "I need your opinion about what to do, man. I can hardly believe what's on this thing," my friend said to me. I could tell from his tone and expression that although he wanted to show me what was on it, he was also nervous and uncomfortable. "Go ahead, click on it," I said. He obliged. I'll describe what I saw now, but believe me, it's not for the faint of heart. Almost made me lose my damn faith in humanity. The video looked to have been filmed on a phone camera. It was actually several videos, all taken at different times and edited together, like a compilation or highlights reel. It started with a man in the back of a truck. He wore a mask to cover his face. In his hand was a hammer. He's laughing with the guy who's holding the camera, but they were speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like Russian, but I can't be sure. The vehicle they're traveling in comes to a screeching halt. The masked man quickly opens up the truck's sliding door and jumps out. The cameraman follows closely behind him. Walking alone down some lonely country road was a man, maybe in his early 30s, I'd say. He looked shocked and confused as the masked man ran up to him. Before he even realized what was about to happen, the guy with the hammer lifts it up and slams it down on the guy's head. It was as graphic as you can imagine. The unsuspecting guy drops to the ground and starts twitching. There's a big dent in his head, captured by the cameraman. It was all over in seconds, and the masked man and the camera holder quickly jump back inside their truck, which starts driving off immediately. They laugh along with the driver. The video quickly cuts to another scene of the masked man, again jumping out the back of a truck. This time, there was a middle-aged woman walking along some woody country path. The masked man runs up to her at full speed. She has time to scream, but nothing more. Before she can even raise her arm to protect herself, she's hit in the head by the hammer. She hits the ground. No movement. The men, again, run back to their vehicle and drive off, laughing and joking. There were 7 more clips like that. In each of them, the masked man lunged from the van at some single person who had no idea what was in store for them. He hits them all in the head, and they all drop to the ground, pools of red spurting out of them. The sound of all the thumps from the hammer were enough to make you want to puke. To think that these people just woke up one morning and figured it was just going to be an ordinary day, only for this to happen to them out of the blue, makes you realize how unpredictable life can be when there's maniacs like this out there. Anyway, I don't know exactly what this video was, when it was made, or where it came from, but it seemed to me like a group of madmen who just drove around lonely country roads, looking for innocent people to strike with a hammer. No rhyme or reason to it. I have no idea how it came to be in that abandoned house, nor do I know the fate of all the people in the video. From what I saw, I wouldn't say any of them survived. My friend agreed to call the authorities and give them the USB. As far as I know, nothing's come of it yet. Hope they catch the guy and his accomplices who filmed it and drove him around. My uncle used to run with some bad guys back in the day. Essentially, him and his pals were aspiring Yakuza, hoping to get a slice of the action. One of these guys was called Haru. Now Haru had a taste for the more seedy things in life. If something was considered bad by society standards, then he probably indulged in it regularly. Well, there was one particular place that Haru liked to go in his free time. Let's call it a lady bar. One of the women who worked there was a particular favourite of his. Her name was Miu. Whenever he went to the place, he'd always ask for Miu. In the end, they actually ended up becoming pretty close. So much so, in fact, that Miu started to fall for Haru and his bad boy ways. She was young and naive, I suppose. Not to mention, a little unhinged. That's what Haru used to say anyway, but he liked that about her. Now Miu had a boyfriend, but it wasn't long before she started telling Haru that she wanted to be with him instead. Haru wasn't looking for Mrs. Wright though. He only wanted Mrs. Right now. No strings attached kind of fun. As such, he flat out told her no. He wanted to keep their relationship strictly business. He was a customer, she a professional. Well, she didn't take kindly to the rejection. One day, Haru went back to the place to see Miu again. He sat down in a private room, and from behind a curtain, Miu appeared. She was brandishing a blade. "So ungrateful," she screamed at him. "Am I not pretty enough for you?" She took the sharp blade and brought it up to her face. She started to drag it down the side of her cheek, slicing it like a thin piece of Kobe beef. "How about now? Or now?" Again, she brought the blade down the side of her face, scraping it along, making long, deep, crimson streaks. She did this over and over, constantly approaching him as he backed away in fear. Soon, her face was almost entirely red. She'd lost her damn mind. Haru ran outside and back to his home in shock. The next day, Haru was out with my uncle and a few of his other friends. They were walking down a back alley, minding their own business. When they were at the end of the alleyway, a van pulled up just in front of them. Several large men dressed like gangsters hopped out, each of them holding a metal pole as a weapon. "So, which one of you morons is Haru?" They all looked at each other. Hesitantly, Haru raised his hand. One of the men slammed a metal pole across Haru's legs, bringing him down to his knees in pain. The rest of the men began wailing on him with their poles as he lied on the floor. They struck him over and over. My uncle and his other friends ran back down the alley. The men from the van let them run. They weren't there for them. My uncle watched from the other end of the alleyway as Haru was picked up, still half conscious and screaming, and thrown into the back of the van. The men drove off, taking Haru with them. Like I said before, Miu had a boyfriend. What Haru didn't know was that he was one of the most prominent Yakuza in the area. She had told her boyfriend her version of events, and he sent some of his goons to go and take care of this Haru fella, the guy who'd supposedly messed up his girlfriend's face. Nobody knows for sure what happened to Haru, but rumors started to spread quickly. The most prominent theory was that he was taken to some disused warehouse, tied to a chair, and had his face cut off without the use of any anesthetic. The Yakuza would have seen this as a fitting revenge for something that, in all honesty, wasn't even Haru's fault. Ultimately, nobody knows what they did with him after they threw him in the van, but that was the last time my uncle ever saw Haru. It was also the end of his foolish dream to become a Yakuza.
This next entry actually comes from one of my earliest videos, but I've always considered it to be one of my favourite stories, and I've wanted to redo it for a long time. Here it goes. During the midsummer, usually around the middle of July, me and a few of my good friends, Ryan, Kevin and Tommy, always made time to go up to Kev's family cabin, located on Vermilion Lake, way up north in the forests of Minnesota. Throughout all of our young years, we would always be accompanied by Kevin's dad, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were juniors in high school, however, we felt mature enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally without Kevin's dad or any other adult supervision. My friend's cabin was very remote and very little, based upon a large island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid half-mile away at least, and you could only get to it by taking a man-made path around the island. I want to mention that to get to my friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the island and take his boat across the lake about a half-mile. Vermilion Lake is huge. My mind always had a tendency to run around while I was sleeping there. The cabin was all on one level, with only 2 bedrooms next to one another, a kitchen and living room area connected to them, and a bathroom in the back of the cabin. There was always one window in each of the rooms with no curtains to them at all, so it was very easy to see outside to the woods and lake. And this is where my mind would run, as I always thought about someone peering in. They never were, of course. I had been to the cabin about a dozen times during my lifespan, and nothing bad ever happened there, so the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now for the event. On this particular trip, we planned to stay around 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were finally on our own, we had set up a campfire and had been drinking beers all night. I don't condone underage drinking, but being the rebels we were, we just so happened to sneak some. We went out to the dock to stare up at the magnificent stars and enjoy our buzz, when all of a sudden, we heard something out on the water that sounded like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked over at the lake, wondering where the splash came from, our fishing poles at the ready. Thankfully, the moon was out that night, which lit up the lake. Without it, it would have been pitch black, what with there being no city lights for miles upon miles. Ryan began to point out to something. Guys, what the hell's that? After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, the only way I can describe it is it simply looked like a head floating out in the middle of the lake, staring at us directly. It was about 3/4 worth of a football field out in the lake from the dock. It had long, black hair and a very pale, skin-like face, but I couldn't make out the eyes, mouth, nose or chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget that feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck and arms all stood up, and I felt paralyzed on the inside and ready to go home at that moment. We told ourselves it was just a loon. Those birds are very popular night drifters on the lake, and they do their hunting late. I mean, it was possible that a loon all of a sudden popped up in the water after hunting for a bit. At least, we tried to convince ourselves of that scenario. All of us had the creeps. That damn thing wasn't moving one bit, just treading water in the same place. We went back to our campfire, lit it even brighter, and headed inside to drink more. We soon forgot about the head-like thing with the help of the beer. That is, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the one inside was preoccupied. I went outside to do my business, seeing how we were in the great outdoors. Whilst taking a pee and glancing at the beautiful moonlit lake, I noticed that the black, circular object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it was staring right up at me. I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went back inside and told my friends to come and look. They all came outside to see it still there, looking at us as if the head was corked up and its chin was in the air. Nobody dared go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, deciding it probably wasn't a loon. For a loon to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck. There was no ripple effect from it at all. We said it was just a log and went back inside. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. A few hours passed. It was super late into the night at this point, and we all knew we needed sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside one last time, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit shore somewhere else. There was no AC in the cabin, and we had to open the windows, or else we'd fry in the middle of summer. Me and Tommy slept in the living room, while my two other friends slept in the 2 bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes shut, I began to hear someone walking around outside at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin. I thought I was about to have a heart attack. No question that whoever or whatever I heard down there was on the deck, pacing back and forth, their feet clicking on the wood. It was as if they weren't sure what to do with themselves. It lasted for about 3 minutes. I wanted to whisper to my buddy, but was frozen in fear. I just kept my eyes shut and my ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they took 2 rapid steps up the deck stairs all of a sudden, but then turned around and sounded like they were sprinting away down the man-made path. After it sounded like the steps were long gone and a couple of minutes had passed, I woke up Tommy and asked him if he'd heard the steps. We both sat up and were startled by Ryan walking out of his room and saying, "We need to leave, now." There was something very disturbing about his expression. I asked him why. He woke up Kevin in the other room. "Come on, get to the boat. It's time to go." "What? Ryan, what the hell's wrong with you?" Kevin asked. Ryan explained to us quickly while grabbing his stuff. I'll never forget what he told us, nor will my other friends. He said that when he was turning sides on his bed to get more comfortable, he saw someone peeking in at the top right corner of the window. The figure quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and long black hair down the window. When looking back at what he experienced, it chills us to the bone to realize that since this face was in the top right corner of the window in my friend's room, it was either damn near 8 foot tall, standing on something like bricks trying to peek in, or was floating. Tommy and I told the others what we had heard outside the cabin, absolutely disturbed the hell out of our minds and feeling like we were going to be sick. We all packed up our stuff and booked it, not cleaning the cabin or anything. We locked up, and as we headed down the stairs, we saw bare footprints in the dirt, heading off along the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our pace, made it to the boat, not knowing what was watching us or around us, threw our stuff in the boat, untied it, and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water. My eyes were just glued to the island, trying to spot anything moving. I saw nothing. When we finally got our stuff packed in the car, we hopped inside and took off. We drove for about 10 miles, when, out of the blue, Ryan all of a sudden broke down in the car, sobbing, saying things like, "What was it, guys? What was it? Oh God, what did I see?" We called to tell our parents what had happened on the way back, told them that Ryan was freaking out. They said to just get home safely and quickly. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept. It was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owns the cabin, went up that following weekend. Said he didn't experience anything weird while there, but did mention that the bare footprints were still lingering about. That bugged him badly. What Ryan saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping for multiple nights and ended up having to seek help for a couple of weeks and hop on some sleeping medicine. As time went on, he ended up being fine, but isn't too comfortable sleeping next to a window without a curtain. To this day, I can't explain what happened, nor why it seemed to happen to us. Nothing has ever happened at that cabin since that night, so we're told by Kevin's dad at least. I personally have never gone back to the cabin,
which really makes me sad because I have some great childhood memories from there. Tommy and Kevin have both been back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to ever set foot there again, and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on that island, so it could have been a prank in the making, and Ryan busted it when he saw the person in the window. It could also have been a person wanting to do something worse to us. I'll never be able to explain what was floating in the lake, but the fact that that incident, along with the footprints and someone looking in at Ryan, all happened in the same night, seems like more than a coincidence to me. This is a rather creepy encounter I had while camping with my older brother a few years back. He's 2 years older than I am, and this happened when we were in college. I was 20, he was 22. When I was a kid, both me and my older brother were in the Boy Scouts. We dropped out due to our time being taken up by sports and other activities. Nevertheless, we both enjoyed camping a lot, and as we got older, we'd plan weekend camping trips together. We lived in New Jersey, and we were always exploring the Pine Barrens, a 1 million plus acre pine forest that covers a large area in the south of NJ. Much of it's deserted, with a lot of unmarked dirt roads that crisscross the state. During the summer, people usually go off-roading, mudding, or dirt biking in the backwoods area, which both my brother and I did quite often. There are a number of state parks and campgrounds in the area, plus a few other more shady campgrounds where people squat for the night and make a home for a while. We tried to avoid the non-legit campsites, as there were usually some shady people around there. There are also quite a few abandoned ghost towns and sites here as well. Early 1800s settlements, iron and paper mills. Anyway, I was on this particular camping trip with my brother, and we decided to make a short drive and make a trip out to a few of our favourite ghost towns. This was during our Easter break from college, so we had a long weekend to go and explore. It had been raining the day before, so we didn't really want to venture too deep into the woods. Some of the dirt roads flood easily, and we didn't want to get stranded. We visited 2 of the towns before the weather started to look like it was going to turn bad again. We decided to find a place to pick up some food and headed off to a spot called Friendship, one of the old ghost towns. Now it's just open cellar holes where some buildings used to be. This ghost town is about 3 or 4 miles off the paved road, down a long, narrow dirt road we call Washboard Avenue. We call it that because the ruts in the road make it feel like you're driving over a washboard or rumble strips. The old town is located at an intersection where you can only turn left or right. If you turn right, you cross an old wooden bridge that takes you to the monument, and then back to the main road. If you turn left, you pass the front of the ghost town and go further into the woods. When we arrived at the town, we parked the truck off the side of the road and quickly set up our tents as the rain was starting to come down. After about a half hour, we finally settled into our tent and ate dinner. We were sharing stories and catching up on old times for a while. We turned in for the night around 9:30 and both fell asleep very quickly. A few hours later, I heard my brother stirring and I woke up. I had to take a leak, so I got up out of my sleeping bag, unzipped the tent flap, and stood up. When I turned to walk across the trail, I looked to my left across the dirt road. There was an opening in the woods, and it looked like there was a figure of a person standing there. It looked like a rather large man. Not fat, but tall and big. It looked like he was wearing a black trench coat, black pants, and a black hat. I didn't want to think too much into it since it was dark out there, and I was still half asleep. It could have just been a tree that had fallen, or just something that looked like a person. I stood there, kinda creeped out, finished my business, and went back inside the tent. I took one more look at the figure before I zipped up the tent flap. The figure was still there, and it looked like it was now much further into the road. It was just creepy. As I got back into my sleeping bag, my brother asked me what I was looking at. I told him I saw something across the road that looked strange. What was it? He asked me in a whisper. I don't know. I think it was just a tree stump, but it looks like a person, I whispered back. Jesus, he said. I think I saw that too when I got up to take a leak. I was creeped the hell out. Yeah, me too. It was just standing there, right across the street. Very creepy. It's probably nothing, just our imaginations, he said. We both fell back asleep. Some more time went by, and I was awoken suddenly by the sound of the tent flapping. I thought it was just the wind at first, but as I gained my senses, it seemed too odd of a noise rubbing on the side of the tent. It was as if someone, maybe even two people, were trying to find the zipper to the tent, rubbing their hands up and down the side of it frantically. It creeped the hell out of me. I finally grabbed the flashlight, shined it in the direction of the noise, and saw a pair of hands pressed into the side of the tent from the outside. I let out a loud yell and threw the flashlight, which landed on my brother. He woke up and quickly sat up to see what was going on. As he did, I swear I heard footsteps walking, thudding, but not running away from the tent. What the hell? What's going on? My brother asked me angrily. People. There are people out there. What people? He asked me, still in a daze. There was someone, maybe two people out there. One of them was trying to get into the tent. Okay, just calm down, he told me. Stay here. I'm gonna take a look outside and see what's there. Don't move. I want to see too, I told him as I sat up. He could see that I was shaken, and I usually don't make jokes like this. He started unzipping the front flap of the tent, and we both poked our heads out. We looked to the left where the truck was parked. Didn't see anything. Looked ahead to the clearing where the mysterious figure was standing before. Nothing. On the right, also nothing. At least, nothing we could see in the dark. Grab the flashlight, I whispered to him. I want to see what that thing was earlier when I took a leak. My brother went back into the tent, grabbed the flashlight, and turned it on. Where did you see it? He asked. Over there, right in front of us. He flashes the light around the opening in the woods, but there was nothing there, just a few tall trees and a few cinder blocks. Are you sure it was across the street? My brother asked. Yeah, straight out across the road from us. I don't see anything, he says, flashing the light some more. You mean on the other side of the street, near the bridge, right? No, right across from us, I said, pointing in the direction. Really? The figure I saw was on the other side, right next to the bridge, he said. Needless to say, we didn't see anything. After the initial shock wore off, we decided to get out of our tent and look around one last time before going back to sleep. We both got out and slowly walked around the tent, using our flashlights to look for anything out of place. We walked across the road to the opening, then down to the bridge, and finally back to the ghost town, looking into all of the open pits. Didn't see anything. We were both very creeped out at this point. We both got back into our tent and decided to try and sleep, agreeing to leave first thing in the morning. I couldn't sleep. 45 minutes passed, just lying awake, hearing more rain coming down, hitting the tent, while my brother snored. After 20 minutes passed, the rain slowed down to just a light drizzle. I was just dozing off when I heard the heavy footsteps again. This time, it sounded like they were running. I was freaked out, but trying to play it off like it was just a deer running through the site. But those footsteps, they were way too heavy. It had to be something larger. I listened for a while. I heard steps, then nothing, then more steps, and nothing, as if people were walking past our tent. Then it got louder. This time, it almost sounded like tap shoes crossing the old wooden bridge nearby. I wasn't taking any chances. I shook my brother awake so he could listen too. He got up and poked his head out of the tent to listen. He said he definitely heard something that sounded like heavy footsteps, almost like whatever it was trying to lure us out. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it out of the tent, looking across the road, then down to the bridge. All of a sudden, he yells out, "Oh God! Oh God!" As he dropped the flashlight outside on the ground, he came back into the tent and shuffled through his duffel bag. I grabbed the flashlight. "Don't go out there," he told me as he grabbed something from his bag. It was a handgun. Before I knew it, he was firing off shots into the darkness in the direction of the bridge. He ended up firing off all the rounds before he zipped up the tent. "What the hell was that? What's out there?" I asked. "People," he yelled back. "4 of them, in black suits." He was almost hyperventilating. "That's what I saw. A man in a black suit, just standing there when I went out before," I told him. We both sat there for a good 15 minutes, trying to process what was happening. Who were these guys? What were they doing there? Why were they screwing with us? Did they follow us? Once we calmed down, I wanted to go back out there with the flashlight and see if the guys were still there. Ultimately, we decided to stay in the tent. Needless to say, neither of us slept for the rest of the night, and we packed up as soon as the sun came up. We both got out of the tent at the same time once it was bright enough. There were no footsteps in the dirt, no handprints on the tent, no sign of the men in black near the bridge, or anywhere for that matter. We packed up as quickly as we could. As my brother closed the back of his truck, I looked into the clearing and saw something black on a stack of old cinder blocks. It could have been a hat or one of the trench coats, one that those men were wearing. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. We got into the truck and sped off. We didn't say much the whole ride home. I was too freaked out to even ask where he got the handgun, or why he brought it with him in the first place. Both of us haven't spoken about this event since, not to each other and not to anyone else. That is, until now. All the way back in 1989, I was on a round-the-world trip. I'd been travelling through Australia, Southeast Asia, and China. To get back to Europe, I decided to take the Trans-Siberian Railway through Mongolia, and also what was then the Soviet Union. In pre-internet days, and with China and the Soviet Union not exactly tourist-friendly countries at the time, this wasn't a super easy thing to do. I had to organise all of my own visas, train tickets, and everything. When I got to Beijing, the hotel I stayed at had free loan bicycles. I grabbed one and made my way around the city to try and find the Mongolian embassy to get my visa. There was only one train running each week, so I was desperate to get this organised as soon as possible. Partially because I was low on money, but I was also quite homesick by now. I'd already gotten a train ticket and a Soviet visa in Hong Kong, but I still needed that visa for Mongolia. Again, this was in pre-internet, pre-Google Maps days. I had a street map, but just couldn't find that bloody embassy. At long last, I got lucky and found it, but by then, they were just shutting the gates. Business hours were already over for the day. It was only 3 p.m. If I couldn't get a visa, I'd not be able to get on that week's train. My train ticket would be worthless, and I'd have to wait a full week for the next train. Plus, I'd need to get a new Soviet visa too. So, I pleaded with the guard. Eventually, he relented and let me in. There was still someone in the office, and because they were keen to finish off for the day, they pretty much just put the sticker on my passport and shuffled me out the door. All set, I got on the train the next day and had an amazing time, going through Mongolia, the Soviet Union, even spent a few days in Moscow, and then headed via Finland and Scandinavia back home. The week after I'd been on the Trans-Siberian train, this happened. A massive gas explosion, caused by a leaking gas pipeline and triggered by a passing train, killed over 500 people. If the Mongolian embassy guard hadn't let me through, I definitely would have ended up being on that train. This one isn't for the weak of stomach amongst you. I'll describe the incident and all its details, but be warned, this wasn't a pretty sight. A few years back, I worked as a first responder out in Oklahoma. A call came through one night about a traffic incident, a hit and run. Apparently, a cyclist had been struck by a vehicle, and things looked pretty bad. Somebody had seen the whole thing and called it in, but said it was probably too late already for the guy. If it wasn't, then it would be real soon. They were doing what they could at the scene. We rushed to their location, knowing that time was of the essence. We came down a quiet country road, trees lining both sides, and sure enough, up ahead in our headlights, we could see two distressed people and a third person lying in the road by a mangled bicycle. I rushed out to help, but instantly I knew the guy in the road was gone. He wasn't wearing a helmet, and blood and brain juices had leaked out all over the road. His limbs were broken and contorted at unnatural angles. There was a long smear of dark red where his torso had slid along the ground, turning the front of his shirt into a bloody rag and completely tearing off all the skin on his body and face. He must have been hit at some speed. I knelt down to see what I could do, though it was obvious to both me and my partner that this was not a survivable accident. I checked for a pulse, just to be sure, but really this was all just procedure. Just as everyone expected, I couldn't find a pulse. I got up to face my partner, who was doing his best to calm the two people who had stopped to help. My back was to the man lying lifeless in the road. I told my partner that there was nothing we could do for the guy, even though I'm sure he already knew that. He says something back to me, but mid-sentence, he abruptly stopped talking. His eyes got real large, as if he had just had the shock of his life. He was looking at something behind me. I turned to look too. Standing there was the injured man, though I have no idea how he was still breathing or able to stand. His head was split open. His face was gone. It was all just red. The only thing distinguishing him as human were the two wide, white eyes. They were filled with confusion and fear. Before anyone had a chance to help him or even speak to him, the injured man ran off the road into the woods at full speed. We couldn't catch up with him. We called the incident in, and a search for the injured man got underway immediately. They never found him. His body was never discovered in the woods. Never has been. He was never reported by any of the hospitals. Nobody in the local community said that they'd seen a severely injured man running around town. For all intents and purposes, he simply vanished somewhere in those woods. Judging by his injuries, there was no way he could have gotten far. Still, he was never seen again. Never reported missing by his family, wherever they were. I know this must all have a logical explanation, and the man just ran off because he was dazed and confused from his injuries. Still, to this day, I have no idea where he went, where his body disappeared off to, or why he was never found. The fact that he was able to regain consciousness and run after the damage he sustained defies belief. And then again, adrenaline's a hell of a thing. Gave me the shock of my life. This story takes place in Wilmington, Delaware. I'll start by saying I'm a female. At the time, I was 26 years old, and I lived by myself in a small house. My boyfriend had just dumped me and left me stranded paying all the rent. As such, I had to moonlight at a bar a few nights a week just to pay the bills. The bar itself was pretty great, definitely a job worth doing while you're still young. Most of our customers were just friendly Wilmington people, but occasionally you get the odd creep or drunk ruffian. Drink can bring out the devil in some folks. There was this one customer who seemed to come in every time I had a shift. A man in his mid-40s, stood around 6'1", I'd say. Went by the name of Dennis. He had a handsome face, but it was all wrinkled, and his obviously once athletic body was now a bit out of shape. He had a small beer belly and dark bags under his eyes. Drove an old, once white van, the colour of which had obviously faded over the years and turned cream. Always parked it right outside. I figured I knew this guy's story pretty well. Probably a bit of a lady killer back in his youth, but was now past his prime and couldn't get over it,
didn't know any other way to live. While all his old buddies that he used to party with got older and settled down, he never got out of the cycle, kept on partying half the week. Some people can never let the past go. Dennis would always sit at the counter and chat with me. I worked there, and it was part of my job to be nice to the customers, so I of course let him. The first few times he talked to me, he seemed really friendly and a nice guy. As time went on though, he became a little more creepy. He started making uncomfortable remarks, and would grab at me inappropriately. I never made a big deal out of it, but made it clear that he couldn't do what he was doing. He always smiled and apologized, vowing to never do anything weird again. He never kept those promises. One night after closing time, I was walking back home by myself. It was dark, and the streets were empty. Plenty of side alleys lined the path that I was walking down. I only lived about 10 minutes away, so I wasn't too unnerved about traveling home alone. As I made my way down the dimly lit streets, I realized I could hear footsteps behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and sure enough, there was Dennis, keeping pace with me, with his hands in his pockets. I picked up my pace, and he picked up his. It was obvious he wasn't just keeping pace with me now, he was actively gaining on me. What his intentions were, I didn't know. I began sprinting down the road, with Dennis hot on my heels. I turned the corner and lucked out. Another passerby. I ran quickly over to them, and Dennis turned down one of the side alleys and disappeared. I told my manager about it the next time I had a shift at the bar. Dennis wasn't allowed back in after that. My next door neighbor, Jim, just so happened to be a police officer. He was a real nice guy, still is, and we sometimes chatted outside our houses when we met each other at the front doors. When I saw him outside his place one day, I happened to mention my new bar job. I ended up telling him all about my creepy customer, Dennis. "Sounds like a loser," Jim said. "You gotta shut guys like that down real quick. Make sure they get the message, otherwise they might never leave you alone." "Yeah," I told him. "I'm starting to get that now. He really spooked me though. I just didn't want to be rude to customers since I'd just started working at the bar. I really need that job, you know." "Well, I'm sure he gets the message now. I'll keep an eye out for you just in case." We said our goodbyes, and I headed back inside my house to enjoy another lonely evening in front of the TV. About 2 weeks went by. I, of course, hadn't seen Dennis at the bar in all that time, seeing how he was banned from entering. I'd just finished a late night shift, and I'd made it back to my place safe and sound. I went inside, threw on my jammies, and hopped into bed. I'd had a couple of drinks while chatting with some customers there, so I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. Next thing I knew, I was awoken by a loud commotion in my hallway, just outside my bedroom. It sounded like fighting. After honing my ears for a moment, I snapped out of my sleepy haze and jumped out of bed. I ran out into the hallway. It was my neighbor, Jim. Underneath him was Dennis. Jim was pinning him down on the floor. "Call the police, now," Jim shouted. I didn't stop to ask questions. I just did as he told me. You see, Dennis had broken into my home while I was asleep that night. He'd used a quiet, glass-cutting tool on one of my downstairs windows. That's how he'd entered the place. He'd brought a sort of club with him, and a chloroformed rag was found in his pocket. My neighbor Jim just so happened to be awake late that night. He noticed a cream-colored van outside my house which he had never seen before. I never usually have visitors over, especially not that late at night. Remembering the story I'd told him, Jim became suspicious and wanted to make sure everything was okay. He checked the perimeter of my house and found that one of the windows had been breached. He climbed in after Dennis and caught him off guard. Thanks to his training, he was able to overpower Dennis. They searched the van outside my house. In the back was a mattress, along with 4 sets of handcuffs to restrain my limbs. Dennis wanted to drag me out to that van, and he didn't want any kind of screaming or resistance. You can guess his intentions. What I don't like to think about is where he was planning on taking me or what he planned to do with me once he was finished. In all likelihood, the only reason I'm here to retell this story is because I happen to live next to a policeman, and that I also happen to tell him about Dennis and his van. The best things happen in the dark.